Welcome to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling and disturbing cases in American criminal history, the Wichita Killer. Between the 1970s and 1990s, a relentless predator terrorized the city with his brutal crimes, leaving the community in a state of fear. How did he manage to evade authorities for so long? And what eventually led to his capture? Stay tuned until the end, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories. City of Wichita, State of Kansas. 1974. The city was gripped by fear because a serial killer was attacking people in their own homes, tying them up, torturing them, and killing them for the pleasure of it. The police during their investigations found semen at the crime scene, which clearly indicated a sexual element of the criminal. They also noticed that the mouths of some victims were quite swollen, which suggested that the killer strangled them, interrupted the strangulation, and then strangled them again. And the most shocking thing is that the person responsible for these brutal murders was living among his victims in the same city he terrorized. He was a man who, for all intents and purposes, seemed to be an exemplary citizen, and although he maintained this appearance, inside there was no doubt that he was a monster. His way of practicing evil was different, mainly because he believed he had the right to commit such atrocities. This is the detailed case of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. So, like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll tell you how this story happened. His name was Dennis Rader, but not long after he would create a murderous alter ego for himself as if it were his own brand of terror. Rader stalked his victims, attacking them in their own homes, where he tortured them and finally took their lives. His preferred method of murder, tying up, torturing, and then killing, became his own name, BTK, which means blind, torture, and kill. After the beginning of his crimes, it took more than 30 years for the authorities to finally bring him to justice. The city of Wichita did not have a bogeyman. They actually had BTK and his horrendous crimes, making Dennis Rader one of the most cruel killers who ever walked this earth. In January 1974, in Wichita, Kansas, one of the most notorious killers in the world began his reign of terror that would last more than 3 decades. What makes Dennis Rader one of the most cruel killers in the world is the pure vanity and arrogance that permeated his life. Every fiber of his being, the Otero family had just moved to the area where Dennis Rader lived and became his first victims. Dennis killed the parents and 2 of the children of the Otero family, leaving the other children alive so that they would discover the murders. In his first crime, he chose to kill 4 people, which in a way is quite a significant task, and it really shows his arrogance and presumption because he believed he was capable of carrying out such an atrocity. Considered as a pillar of the community, Dennis Rader was involved with the church and was even a scout leader, but still continued to kill 6 more times, with his last murder occurring in 1991 when he attacked Dolores Davis in her own home. At the time of this crime, Rader was at a scout camp from which he briefly left, apparently to create an alibi, and once again he tied up, tortured, and finally took the life of this victim, this time using her own pantyhose. After committing the crime, Rader abandoned Dolores' body far from his home. However, the killer's ego combined with new technologies finally put him in the sights of the police and the FBI after he began writing letters to local newspapers bragging about his crimes, which eventually led to his capture. Dennis Rader sent letters to local newspapers and the television station bragging about the murders he had gotten away with. Some people even think that if he had remained silent, it is possible that he would never have been caught. However, his arrogance and complacency ended up betraying him. Dennis did not only enjoy torturing his murder victims, but also tormenting the families of these victims. Whenever he had the opportunity to relive and retell the stories of his crimes, he did so, thus prolonging the suffering of the poor families. Dennis made the most of the opportunity to remember and recount the horrendous acts he had committed. He was someone who truly delighted in revealing all the explicit and macabre details of his crimes for decades while he remained in Wichita, The largest city in the state of Kansas lived in terror of the killer, who called himself BTK, this acronym referring to the terms blind torture and kill, which translates to mean to tie, torture, and kill with killers like Rader. There will always be side effects. Someone who kills in such a brutal way inevitably causes deep damage to the community over time, leaving scars that last over time. There was a climate of constant fear in Wichita. People looked through their window curtains, watching their neighbors with suspicion, which ended up in a paranoia associated with the situation experienced in those years. Everyone ended up wondering when he would attack again or who the next victim would be. Dennis Rader. Finally, he was arrested in 2005 and his reign of terror came to an end. However, even at that moment he reveled in the attention he received. Dennis confessed to his crimes. At no time did he deny having committed the murders. In fact, he even seemed proud of his actions. It is believed that Rader enjoyed the notoriety that he finally obtained. After all, people now knew who BTK was. The story of this killer begins in 1945. He was born in the city of Pittsburgh, in the state of Kansas, on March 9th, being the oldest of 4 brothers, son of William and Dorothy Rader. Dennis grew up in a traditional family, and although his father was strict, he was not particularly abusive. Many children grew up in homes like Dennis Rader's, and he was seen as an exemplary young man. He participated in scout groups and various programs aimed at well-behaved children. However, he had the ability to blend in and was not bullied, as is the case with most serial killers. For his friends and family, he was a child model, however, in particular Dennis. He began to reveal his true tendencies. He admits that when he was young he abused animals, stating that he had even strangled a cat and a dog. According to psychological theories and studies, this type of behavior is common in many cases of future murderers. When he entered puberty, he stated that he looked at women's magazines, developing a fascination with underwear, something that in fact became deeply significant in his later crimes, as he harbored this fascination with bondage and sadomasochism. He graduated from a local high school in Wichita in 1965. Dennis Rader enrolled at Wesleyan College in the state of Kansas in the city of Salina, about 145 kilometers from his home. However, he dropped out of school in 1966. Now at the age of 21, Rader joined the United States Air Force, where he remained for 4 years. During his service, he learned to work with security systems, something that suited his personality. Methodical, he ended up serving in several places, including Europe, and although his military career was not particularly notable, it was not considered bad either. After this period, Dennis returned to IT, where his ordinary life continued to disguise his dark intentions. Upon returning to the Kansas Stadium, Dennis Rader married an old schoolmate and started a family. He had 2 children, and from the outside his life seemed like that of a traditional and respectable family, like the one you would see in serial commercials, as if it were an ordinary American family. However, in the year 1974, Rader underwent a sudden and inexplicable change, going from a respected ex-military man to a brutal and cruel killer. It is not known for sure what triggered this behavior, because this first act of violence was an unexpected and shocking explosion, marking the beginning of his reign of terror as the BTK killer. It was something so shocking, dramatic, and horrifying that no one could have imagined. It was like going from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds. The first family to fall into their hands was the Otero family, who had recently moved to Wichita in search of a new stage in their lives. However, tragically, what should have been a fresh start for them ended up becoming the beginning of Dennis Rader's reign of terror. On January 15, 1974, the Otero family's teenage children arrived home and were faced with a horrific scene. The Y police were called to the scene, and Detective Tim Ralph, who would later be part of the BTK task force, was one of the investigators at the Otero family home. The police were called by the three oldest children who discovered the bodies of their parents and younger siblings who had been brutally murdered. The three oldest children found their parents dead when they arrived home and immediately called the authorities. The first responders to the call were faced with a horrific scene. Dennis Rader had broken into the Otero family home and cruelly murdered all members present using the method that would become his trademark: tying, torturing, and killing. Dennis tied the husband and wife with a cord from a blind and suffocated them when the older children arrived home and found the scene. They did not want their younger siblings to see what had happened, believing that they were still at school. However, when the police went to the elementary schools in the area, they discovered that the two youngest children had not arrived at school that day, which led them to believe that they had also been killed in the massacre. When the police searched the house, it soon became clear that the parents were not the only victims. The 9-year-old son Joseph Otero and his sister Josephine were also found murdered, with Josephine being discovered hanging in the basement. It is still not known for sure whether Dennis Rader killed her by hanging or if he strangled her first and then hung her body. The brutality of the crimes created a situation of unspeakable horror that shook the Wichita community to its core. Rader transformed the basement into a kind of macabre setting by creating elaborate nooses and hanging Josephine's body as if it were a disturbing artistic display. Observing the entire scene, it seems that he focused his attention on the youngest daughter Josephine spending more time with her body, treating her as a prize for his atrocity, while the other family members were just obstacles he needed to eliminate. He also took the life of the boy Joseph Jr. by tying him up and leaving his body on the bedroom floor, again using asphyxiation as a method. The meticulous brutality with which he committed these crimes showed the depth of his wickedness. Dennis Rader had murdered 4 members of the Otero family: Joseph, the 38-year-old father; Jolie, the 33-year-old mother; Joseph Jr., the 9-year-old youngest son; and Josephine, the daughter of 11 years. The case of the Otero family revealed the mental profile of this killer, clearly suggesting that he was involved in some kind of bondage fantasy. The manner in which Rader killed the family showed the first signs of what would become his modus operandi. Police found semen at the crime scene, indicating that there was a sexual element to his violent acts, which added an even more disturbing dimension to his crimes. There was clearly a sexual element to these crimes. Police also discovered that the faces of some of the victims were quite swollen, suggesting that the killer was strangling them, interrupting the strangulation, and then resuming it, literally keeping them on the edge between life and death. Dennis Rader literally watched as the life drained from his victims' bodies, only to allow them to breathe again temporarily, thus exerting absolute control over their survival. This desire to have total power over another person's life was a fundamental part of his perversion and sadism. The pleasure that Dennis Rader found in controlling the fate of his victims, deciding between life and death, was varied. It is clear that he deeply enjoyed the power over the death of another person. Unfortunately, this was not an isolated act by a madman, but the first in a series of murders that would terrorize the city of Wichita. Just a few months later, in April 1974, Dennis Rader struck again, following the classic pattern of escalation of serial killers. Rader continued his crimes with a new victim, 21-year-old Caterine Bridget, who was a very attractive young woman. He broke into her house armed when no one was there. When Caterine and her brother Kevin returned home at lunchtime, Dennis Rader confronted them. He forced Kevin to tie Caterine to a chair and then began to fight with Kev. Kevin fought bravely with Rader, which clearly angered him. In response, Rader shot Kevin in the head. Miraculously, he survived the shooting and managed to escape to seek help. However, unfortunately, it was too late for his sister Caterine. Rader tried to tie her up, but something went wrong and the process ended. The binding came undone, but Caterine was unable to escape, becoming yet another victim of his brutality at that moment. Dennis, frustrated with his failed attempt to tie Caterine, grabbed a knife and brutally stabbed her several times. After that, he left the house, believing that he had also killed Kevin. However, Rader did not realize that Caterine's brother had escaped and had gotten help from a neighbor who called the police. When the first officers arrived, Caterine was still alive, but breathing with great difficulty. They were unable to identify her attacker. She was taken to the hospital but unfortunately did not survive her injuries, dying shortly after. Caterine Bridget was tied up, tortured, and murdered. She died in surgery a few hours later. Her brother Kevin was the first person to provide clues to the police about Dennis Rader's identity. Kevin described his attacker as a white man weighing about 82 kilograms. Based on this description, the police began looking for a suspect with these characteristics, a white man in his early 20s who acted alone. This initial information was crucial to the investigations that would unfold in the years that followed. The description provided by Kevin could correspond to many men in the state doses, however, it was a starting point for the investigations, although it was not enough to lead to an immediate capture. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader returned to hiding behind his mask of exemplary citizen, returning to the role of pillar of the community, involved in the church and in local activities. The police, without concrete leads and with a brutal killer still on the loose, continued to face difficulties. It was known, however, that it was only a matter of time before Rader struck again. So far there had occurred in January the murders of the Otero family, and in April the murder of Catherine Bridget and the attack on her brother Kevin. At this point, the police still did not have a clear understanding of what they were facing cases of. Violence of this magnitude were rare in Wichita, and they were dealing with something far beyond the ordinary by the end of that same year. The police believed they had finally made a breakthrough in the investigation of the murders, however. Despite this apparent progress, the true horror of what was to come was still only beginning. In October 1970, the police arrested 3 men on suspicion of involvement in the Otero family murders, and Dennis Rader was furious to him. This was outrageous. These were his crimes and no one else should take credit for them. We can almost hear him saying to himself, "This is absolutely unacceptable. These are my crimes, and no one else can take credit for them, in my opinion." Rader's indignation was not only because he had been deprived of recognition for his brutal acts, but also because for him these murders were part of his identity, as if they were his work, which he did not accept being attributed to third parties. Dennis Rader was extremely angry when he learned that the murders he had committed were being attributed to other people. In response, he wrote a letter to the newspaper The Wit Eagle, assuming responsibility for the murders of the Otero family. He hid this letter inside a textbook in the public library in Itagai and then called a hotline for the investigations of the Otero family murders to inform them where the letter could be found. The letter, in which Rader Havey indicated the murders, was written with spelling mistakes and poor grammar, demonstrating a clumsy and disorganized writing style. The content of the letter made it clear that he was seeking recognition for the brutal crimes he had committed, confirming his need for attention and control over his work. Despite the confusing writing, Dennis's motivation was absolutely clear in his letter. He tried to justify the murders with the phrase, "I can't stop this monster is still inside me, hurting me just as it hurts society." Rader suggested that society should be grateful for the fact that he found temporary relief in his fantasies, in which he imagined victims being tortured and becoming his own. This letter was quite important because it began to reveal this full awareness of the terror he was causing. He was not only admitting his actions, but also demonstrating that he was responsible for the murders. The pleasure in causing fear. In addition to his attempt to justify his monstrous actions as something uncontrollable by portraying them as both an aggressor and a victim of his own mind, Rader Went even further when he created a name for his alter ego, seeking to establish a brand for himself. He did not want to be just a nameless killer. He wanted recognition and an identity that reflected his crimes. Although he did not want to be captured, he also craved notoriety and wanted his actions to be attributed to him. In this way, he created the nickname Bet, which represented his methodology of crime: blind, tying up, torturing, and killing. From that moment, Dennis Rader would become known as the BTK, a name that would become synonymous with terror in the city, of thus immortalizing his dark legacy as he continued to communicate with the press. He made a frightening threat that made it clear that he would strike again during this time. Ironically, Rader had started working for a security company installing systems in people's homes. You can imagine the reaction of the residents of Wichita at that moment, because with a serial killer on the loose, fear spread throughout the city. Many residents began to purchase elaborate security systems to protect their homes, unaware that the killer himself was involved in installing these devices, which added an even more disturbing layer to his story. In fact, it became incredibly ironic that the residents of Wichita were investing in alarms and security systems, while the killer, Dennis Rader, who was installing these devices, was the man they needed to protect themselves from, the one who should have been committed to people's safety. In fact, it was a predator on the prowl. It was almost 3 years before Dennis Rader killed again in 1977. He murdered Shirley Vian, another victim in his long series of brutal crimes. This pattern of long intervals between murders kept the police and the community on constant alert, but they were unable to capture him. When he broke into the home of this last victim, Rader locked Shirley's 3 children in the bathroom, isolating them from that was about to happen. While the children screamed and cried in the bathroom, he tortured and murdered Shirley in a completely apathetic manner. The children's despair echoed through the house, but they were defenseless, locked in, and unable to prevent the attack or help their mother. This crime, like so many others, it showed the level of cruelty and lust for power of Dennis Rader, who not only killed but also enjoyed inflicting psychological terror on his victims and their families. The only thing that one can feel any relief or imagine about this horrific scene is that the children locked in the bathroom could not see what was happening to their mother. Once again, Rader used strangulation to kill his victim, and it became increasingly evident that he had a certain obsession with tying ropes as part of his murderous acts. His actions were far beyond any experience considered normal. The body seemed to be almost secondary to Dennis, as the focus seemed to be on displaying his skills in tying knots. Once again, he disappeared from the crime scene like a ghost, leaving behind little to no forensic evidence. This was a seemingly random murder with no pattern that the police could analyze. Later that same year, on December 8, 1977, with the police still without a clue as to the killer, Rader continued to evade punishment, keeping the Wichita community in constant suspense state of fear and uncertainty without the police having any clue as to his identity. Dennis Rader struck again after the murder of Shirley Vian. He killed Nancy Fox, who worked as a secretary and was 25 years old. Rader probably stalked her for some time before acting. By this time, he had refined his criminal techniques, becoming increasingly efficient in this way. Before entering Nancy's house, Rader cut the telephone lines outside, demonstrating his planning and premeditation. This showed how he was becoming increasingly skilled in his crimes, increasing the terror in the community. Dennis waited inside Nancy Fox's house until she returned. She became, in a way, the archetypal victim of BTK. He completely invaded her privacy, entering her house, tying her up, and then strangling her with a belt. Rader even masturbated at the crime scene, revealing once again the sexual component of his acts. Despite this, what made this crime even more frightening was the fact that he, having called the police shortly after the murder, there was a recording of Dennis Rader's voice, thus providing the police with a crucial clue: the voice of the killer. This marked an important point in the investigation. Although Rader's identity still remained unknown, what could be seen is that he was once again celebrating his own power. His attitude, without a shadow of a doubt, demonstrated arrogance, almost as if He was parading with complete confidence, knowing that he had information that no one else knew, and it was this feeling of control and superiority that fed his ego in just 4 years. Rader had murdered 7 people, and yet the police remained without concrete clues as to his identity. He continued to escape justice, which only increased his sense of impunity and the terror he caused in the community. The police did not have much to work with except for a few scattered clues and a voice recording with some noises. Dennis Rader continued to evade capture, leaving the authorities perplexed. However, his hunger for recognition grew. He observed all the attention that the serial killers like Ted Bundy were getting paid, and in his vanity he wanted some of that notoriety for himself. He didn't just want to be another serial killer, he wanted to be even more notorious, seeking recognition and fame for his own brutal crimes. His need for validation and prominence was as great as his cruelty, which motivated him to continue his reign of terror. Dennis Rader, just like Ted Bundy, wanted more than just to be a notorious serial killer. The comparison with other killers bothered him, and that was what drove his crimes and the way he committed them. The truth is that he craved recognition and fame, believing that he deserved a prominent place among the most infamous killers. A month after the murder of Nancy Fox, Rader sent a note to the local television station in which he described the details of the crime. In the letter, he mentioned in a cold and disturbing way that he could close her eyes so that she could rest in peace. This type of communication evidenced not only the need for attention, but also the pleasure he felt in controlling the narratives of his crimes, and it remains, of course. This is an act of extraordinary vanity. In the note sent to the television station, he again mentioned, "I will do it again." Those 7 murders, committed until 1978, were directly attributed to BTK. During that period, he made several communications sending messages to the authorities and to the media. At that time, Rader communicated with the local newspaper, and the 7 murders were always attributed to him. The local police detective Rainstone realized that Rader was enjoying the attention he received. He loved watching his crimes on television, so communicating with the media was a way to achieve the notoriety he so desired and to keep himself in the spotlight. He really enjoyed being publicized and watching investigations about himself on television. He favored the news stations that had the best signal on his TV, which allowed him to follow his own notoriety. One of the things that fed Rader's appetite for publicity was his full awareness that he was not only terrorizing his individual victims, but also spreading fear throughout the city. He lived in absolute terror, and this somehow gave Dennis a sense of power and control over that community. Sales of the security systems that Dennis Rader installed were increasing rapidly. It became increasingly evident that there was a serial killer at work, and all the victims were in Wichita, a relatively small city. The fact that the police had no suspects further aggravated the panic. The community was especially terrified because the authorities had to inform the population that a serial killer was on the loose. Without any concrete suspects, fear only grew. People did not know who would be the next victim, which increased the climate of tension and insecurity in the city. The police were forced to alert the community so that people would take security measures and protect themselves and their loved ones. The tranquility and peace typical of the suburbs of the 1970s had been completely shaken by these murders. After mobilizing dozens of police officers and thousands of hours of investigation, the authorities realized that they had no concrete clues to stop the killer. However, suddenly BTK seemed to have disappeared. The abrupt end of his attacks brought a strange feeling of relief mixed with uncertainty because no one knew the reason for his pause, and if he would attack again. As the years passed, there was no more sign of Dennis Rader, and the case went cold. Many wondered if he had really escaped with impunity because after 5 years he entered a state of inactivity. No one knew for sure if he had stopped killing or if there were other murders that were not linked to him. The mystery and silence surrounding BTK left the police and the Wichita community in suspense with no clear answers as to what had made him stop. As the years passed without any more attacks from BTK, the Witt police decided to call the FBI. The local authorities then formed a task force, and this ironically was called Ghostbusters, in an attempt to identify the killer. However, the efforts were fruitless, because the team could not even come close to capturing Dennis Rader. The investigations into the BTK case continued for the next 3 years, but despite his diligent work, Rader remained untouchable, continuing to evade police and frustrating investigators at every step during those years. The theory emerged that BTK was either in prison or dead or had left the area. This idea served as the basis for the investigation of the task force that focused on searching for men who had left the region. After 1979, with more than 600 suspects were investigated by the team, but none of them could be linked to the murders. Despite all the effort, the identity of Dennis Rader continued to elude the authorities, leaving the case shrouded in mystery for many years, with no new connections to the BTK murders. Questions and rumors began to circulate about the fate of the killer. With the absence of more crimes in the Wichita area, some believed that the horror was over. However, in 1985, Dennis Rader killed again. This time he changed the pattern of his victims, altering his victimology and surprising the authorities, who had already begun to think that the serial killer had disappeared or stopped. This new wave of violence rekindled fear in the community, and this time, instead of a young woman, Dennis Rader chose an older victim, Maren Hedge, aged 53, who actually lived very close to Rader. After years without committing murders, it is possible to imagine the tension and impulses that must have been accumulating in his disturbing mind. With the murder of Maren, Rader began to change his modus operandi. He no longer followed exactly the same patterns as his victims, showing an evolution in his criminal behavior which made it even more difficult for the police to predict his movements. Dennis not only murdered Maren but also took her body in every possible way to a church. There he placed her in degrading positions and took photographs before finally disposing of the body in another location. This act clearly showed how he saw his victims only as mere objects, toys for his sadistic pleasure. With this crime, it was clear that BK was back, still managing to evade capture and keeping the city of Wichita in suspense. And the level of dehumanization and cruelty displayed by Rader in this murder demonstrated an intensification of his perversion and control. Dennis Rader, increasingly confident and audacious, disposed of Maren's body about 7 miles away in a ditch, and, as was his custom, he clearly took some of the trophies of the crime and showed total disrespect for the victim. This case was not initially linked to BTK, mainly because it occurred in a completely different part of the city, a few miles outside of the city, almost on the edge of the urban area. This change in location contributed to the difficulty for authorities in making an immediate connection with the other BTK murders. In September 1986, a year after his last crime, Dennis Rader murdered Vicki Worley, a 28-year-old woman, while she was at home with her 2-year-old son. Dennis had noticed Vic as a very attractive mother, and she was walking toward his house. It is still not known exactly how he gained access to Vic's residence, but as in his other crimes, he took the opportunity to attack Rader, who had already become an expert in approaching his victims in a discreet manner. He continued his series of murders, terrorizing the community of Wichita and its surroundings. What we do know is that Dennis repeated his pattern. Vicky's husband was returning home for lunch, and when he arrived, he found his 2-year-old son sitting on the floor alone. Upon entering another room, he discovered the body of his wife Vicky, who was already dead. This time, BTK was not immediately considered a suspect. The murder of Vic Wager, despite following many of the same traits as Rader's other crimes, was not initially linked to him and allowed him to continue to evade justice and keep his identity a secret for a long time. At first, the police believed Vic's murder to be a case of domestic homicide, and her husband ended up being questioned by Judge Kevin O.C. Connor, who at the time was an assistant prosecutor, recalls the case and mentions that her husband, Mr. Wigger, was always considered a suspect. When Judge Connor became involved in the investigation, the focus was still on the husband, since in many domestic violence cases the spouse is the prime suspect. This initial shift in focus allowed Dennis Rader, the real culprit, to remain off the police radar for longer. After some time, when DNA replication technology became viable, the authorities gained the ability to conduct tests without exhausting the original sample. So in the late 1990s, the police began to have access to new technologies that could be applied in homicide cases such as the Vicky Worley case. These innovations in evidence collection and analysis promised to significantly improve investigations by making it possible to link criminals to crime scenes more effectively and accurately. The first places where this technology began to be applied coincided with the discoveries about DNA and other advances with the emergence of video and computers. The ability to track people through different means became something they needed to reevaluate in order to see if it would be possible to use these new technologies in a useful way. With the reevaluation of old evidence, DNA found at the crime scene soon proved that the husband was innocent and the mysterious murder remained unsolved. Once again, the killer known as BTK managed to escape in Pune and disappeared completely without contacting the police, the local media, or any television station. He went back to hiding behind the image he had built over the years, that of a respectable citizen, married and father of 2 children. In fact, he would not kill again for CCO years. His last murder was recorded on January 19, 1991. The victim was Dolores Davis, 62 years old, who did not fully fit the profile of his previous victims, as she was significantly older at the time. Rader was at a Boy Scout camp, from which he discreetly left during the night, probably to establish an alibi. Just as in his previous crimes, he tied her up, tortured her, and finally killed her, this time using the victim's half-blood, and discarded her body in a distant location, making it even more difficult for the police to identify a pattern. Just like the previous victims, Dolores was found naked and abandoned. However, this time, far from her home, the crime scenes were different, since he removed the victim's body from the house, adopting a slightly different approach. He needed to move his victims to places where he could exercise greater control over them. Hence the reason for choosing older people. The police still had no clues that could lead to the identification of the killer. On one occasion, Rader returned to the place where he had left the body and took Polaroid photos of the victim wearing a female mask while doing so. Once again, the police were perplexed. Rader disappeared again, completely falling off the radar. Up until that point, BTK had already murdered 10 people and continued to roam freely through the streets of Wichita for over a decade. However, in 2004, on the anniversary of his first murders, his ego was once again awakened. A local author was preparing to release a book entitled Nightmare in Wichita, but he did not think that this would awaken Rader's vanity, as it would certainly be the idea of someone else telling his story in this way. Rader thought, "If anyone is going to tell my story, then let it be me." City of Wichita, State of Kansas, year 2004. The residents of this city in the central United States knew Dennis Rader as a family man who attended church. However, for decades he got away with it, tying up, torturing, and killing his victims to feed his disturbing alter ego. 30 years had passed since the first murders committed by BTK, marking the murder of the Otero family. A reporter from a local newspaper wrote an article commenting on this milestone, highlighting that another year had passed and the case still remained unsolved. Apparently, BTK read this article, and upon discovering that a book was being written about the case, he thought that no one would be more qualified to tell this story than himself. From that moment on, Dennis resumed contact with the media, seeking to return to the center of attention. He wanted to control the narrative and ensure that he was recognized for the crimes he committed. For Rader, it was essential that no one take credit for these acts. Some time later, he sent letters to the newspaper under his usual pseudonym Bill Thomas Kilman using the initials BTK. He included in the correspondence a copy of Vicky Wegerle's driver's license and photos of the crime scene, and this marked the beginning of a series of clues that would link Rader to all the other victims. He began to provoke the police, as if to say, you may think you know, but in fact it is I who knows, and what is most important is that I can prove it. Here are some examples. Initially, he began to leave small items taken from the crime scenes in unusual places. BTK had returned to torment the police, and the investigators knew that this time they needed to capture him. In one of his communications, Dennis made a mistake that could leave a breakthrough in the investigation. He had left a box of cereal at the Home Depot in the city of Wichita. Rader found it ironic to use cereal boxes, thus making a pun on the fact that he was a serial killer. The authorities went to the Home Depot and began a series of interviews, and one of the employees reported that he had found something in the bucket of his truck, but that he had thrown it away. He took the object to his house and opened it. Inside he found a doll and some other items, but he ended up thinking it was a prank or a joke. Without giving it much importance, he threw it away, but he did not take the trash to the street to be taken away by the garbage collectors. The authorities then searched and managed to recover the package, and during the investigation, the Home Depot provided a surveillance video of the parking lot. Through the images, it was possible to identify a vehicle entering that appeared to be a Jeep Cherokee or a very similar model. This information became crucial because at that time it was something that only the authorities knew, but the criminal was not yet aware of it. Rader had no idea that the police were already aware of this lead, and although they finally had an image of BTK, the CCTV recording was grainy and unclear, representing only a small clue. In his effort to remain hidden, BTK's communication methods became progressively more complex. He and the police began communicating through small advertisements in the Wichita Eagle newspaper. In one of these communications, he finally asked the police, if I would send a diskette with more details about the murders, would you be able to track me? Please answer without misleading me. Dennis Rader insisted that the police be honest, believing that the police could not lie. However, it seems obvious that the authorities can lie when it comes to catching a serial killer. The cops then responded by saying, "Hex, it will be fine," which translated would mean send whatever you want because we can't track you, Rader. So he sent a floppy disk to a local TV station. The police examined it, and with that one mistake, the case was completely revealed. The station, called XAWS, affiliated with Fox TV, contacted the authorities after receiving a suspicious package. They initially did not realize it was from BTK, but when they opened it and found the diskette among the items, they immediately called the police. The authorities were notified, and the detective was informed of the receipt of the diskette. He clearly remembers and will never forget being present when the diskette was inserted into the computer. At that moment, Ron Stoney, the computer expert, began to analyze the language on the diskette, something that was beyond the immediate understanding of many people. While the analysis was being done, the investigator was sitting in a cubicle, completely apprehensive and waiting for the result. The expert found himself surrounded by more than 20 people huddled together in a semicircle around him. The pressure was so great that you could almost hear people thinking, "Don't make a mistake at this moment." He created an image of the disk, opened the file, and began to explore its contents. There was a test file called a RTF, a Microsoft Office document or something similar. The file was a Word document, and in it appeared the name Dennis, followed by some meaningless characters, and then the following name appeared: Lutheran Church of Christ. Upon seeing this, one of the detectives who was sitting next to Rund immediately searched for the Lutheran Church of Christ on Google, and in the corner of the official website was the photo of the president of the church. It was Dennis Rader. The detective states that the memory of that moment still gives him chills because it was impossible not to look at it and think the team finally identified the suspect. It was really him. From now on, it is up to us to prove that Dennis Rader was in fact the BTK. The investigation progressed quickly, and they discovered that Dennis Rader had a address in Park City. When investigators went to the street where he lived, they immediately recognized the vehicle they had seen in the Home Depot parking lot, and it was parked in Rader's driveway. At that point, everyone already knew it was not clear how this would end, but there was certainty that they had caught him. It was then that one of the detectives made a call. He never imagined he would make. He called his superior to inform him, "We caught him." However, the police still did not have enough evidence to arrest Rader. They needed more concrete evidence to confirm that Rader was in fact BTK. To obtain a DNA sample from Rader, the police took the unusual step of going to a hospital and requesting the pap smear that his daughter had taken. They compared the extracted DNA with the genetic material found at several crime scenes, including the semen collected. The match was extremely close, indicating that the donor was a family member, and with this evidence, the police were finally able to move forward and make his arrest. On February 25, 2005, the contingent was sent to Park City, and at exactly 12:15 a.m. Dennis Rader was arrested. He was finally detained and charged with 10 murders, including the Otero family murder. Although the police suspected that Rader, under his alter ego BTK, was involved in several other crimes, only he knew the full extent of the truth. At that time, the interrogation was conducted with great caution, as the case was divided into several sessions and investigators began to take turns. Dennis remained in custody for almost a year. During this time, he spoke for almost 34 hours. He came to see himself as a sort of instructor, referring to the period as the golden age of serial killers. When the interviews were completed, one of the investigators returned from serving the search warrants. Rader was in the interrogation room, already wearing a vest and restrained with handcuffs and chains around his waist. Ron Stone poked his head in the door and said, "It's good to finally put a face to the name I found on the disc." Then Rader looked up with a curious expression and said, "So it was you and Rand?" Answer: yes. It was me. Dennis could not accept the fact that the police had lied to him because the investigators said they could not track him through the diskette, and this disagreement from Dennis only shows that he saw everything as a game and did not care at all about the victims of his crimes. After the interviews began, there was even an exchange of jokes. The atmosphere was very light, and Rader even made jokes saying, "If I leave here someday, I will find you and fill your mouth with diskettes." Finally, BTK was off the streets and in custody. He was taken to prison, where everyone in the cells and in the detention areas knew that the moment had finally arrived. The cells were all made of glass, and the prisoners began to approach to take a look, and soon they began to make a noise, beating us as if they were chanting and praising BTK's name. With a big smile on their face, Rader raised his hands and showed both thumbs up in approval, while the prisoners continued chanting his name. What this demonstrated was that he loved that attention. On March 1, 2005, Dennis Rader was formally charged with the murders of the Otero family: Deer Bridge, Dave Fox, Marin H.G.E., Vic Wigger, and Dolores Davis. When he first appeared before the judge, he refused to plead his guilt, leading the judge to record a not guilty plea on his behalf, as Rader preferred to remain silent. This occurred in March of the year 2005. Later, in June of that same year, he was finally taken to trial. However, before the formal start of the process, he changed his plea, and because he did not want a hearing, he pleaded guilty to the murders and tried to avoid any type of formal hearing. However, the prosecutor considered it crucial that the community knew exactly what had happened, and the best way to ensure this would be through a public hearing, since once open to the public, everyone would have access to the information. The monster had finally revealed himself completely. Rader was fully willing to acknowledge that he had escaped punishment for 30 years and that he would be remembered in history as BTK. Furthermore, he was determined to make sure the world knew how evil he really was. During the hearing, Rader detailed the murders, showing little to no remorse. He offered no apology, further shocking viewers. While most sentencing hearings last only a few hours, this particular one stretched over 3 days, and during that time evidence of the murders was presented, comparing what was found at the crime scenes with his own confession as a way of ensuring to the community that he was indeed the culprit. In addition, the families of the victims had the chance to make their statements. It was a truly devastating and painful moment for everyone, but perhaps it brought some relief to the families of the victims knowing that after so many years the killer of their loved ones had finally been captured and imprisoned. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, a minimum of 175 years. He remains in solitary confinement where he will spend the rest of his life. One of the most striking images is that of Dennis Rader being taken to the El Dorado Penitentiary in the state of Kansas. The truth is that there is something about Rader that genuinely disturbs your soul, especially that look that never leaves your mind, that little smile and the gleam in his eyes that seems to say, "I am better than you." Dennis Rader built a depraved alter ego that terrorized an entire generation, and it was his own arrogance that led to his downfall. For more than 30 years, he was one of the most dangerous criminals in the world. Most elusive in the world, provoking the police and defying the press, he brutally murdered 10 people, including 2 children, following his cruel pattern of tying up, torturing and killing everyone to build a sick identity as BTK and establish himself as one of the most evil serial killers in history. As we close this chapter on one of the most terrifying crime sprees in Wichita's history, we are reminded of the resilience of the victims' families and the persistence of investigators who never gave up. The case may be solved, but the impact of the Wichita killer's actions will never be forgotten. If you found this deep dive insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping crime stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.